In the winter of 1943, thousands of Dutch Jews received official-looking documents from what appeared to be German authorities, ordering them to report for deportation to labor camps in the East. The letters bore authentic Nazi seals, used proper German administrative language, and arrived through normal postal channels. Families receiving these letters faced an impossible choice: obey and face almost certain death in concentration camps, or refuse and face immediate arrest and execution. But something about these letters was different from previous deportation orders. The reporting dates were inconsistent. The locations specified for assembly didn't quite match known German procedures. Small details in the formatting seemed slightly off to those who looked carefully. These letters were not actually from German authorities at all. They were sophisticated forgeries created by a Dutch resistance cell that had infiltrated the printing facilities producing Nazi documentation. The false deportation orders were designed to create confusion, to make Jewish families question which orders were real, to encourage them to go into hiding rather than report, and to overwhelm German administrative systems with chaos. By the time German authorities realized what was happening and attempted to sort real orders from false ones, thousands of Dutch Jews had disappeared into hiding networks, saved by propaganda sabotage that turned the Nazis' own bureaucratic machinery against them. This is the story of how resistance fighters weaponized propaganda itself, how forgery became salvation, and how sabotaging information systems saved more lives than armed resistance ever could. Welcome to Cipher Tales, where we decode the hidden secrets of World War II at the intersection of propaganda and espionage. Today, we revealed the extraordinary operations where resistance movements didn't just counter Nazi propaganda, but actively sabotaged it, infiltrating production facilities, corrupting distribution networks, and creating false materials so sophisticated that even German authorities couldn't always distinguish them from genuine propaganda. This was information warfare at its most aggressive and creative, where the goal wasn't simply to spread truth against lies, but to destroy the enemy's ability to communicate effectively at all. The resistance members who conducted propaganda sabotage operations demonstrated that attacking the enemy's information systems could be as effective as attacking their military forces, and that well-executed deception could save thousands of lives that weapons never could. The concept of propaganda sabotage emerged from the recognition that Nazi control over occupied populations depended heavily on effective communication and information management. The Nazi regime used propaganda not just to demoralize enemies and maintain support at home, but as a practical tool of administration and control. Orders for labor conscription, instructions for curfews and restrictions, announcements of penalties for resistance activities, all of these flowed through propaganda channels that the Nazis had established throughout occupied Europe. If these channels could be disrupted, if the information flowing through them could be corrupted or made unreliable, then Nazi control itself would be undermined. This realization led resistance movements to develop sophisticated operations targeting the production, distribution, and credibility of Nazi propaganda materials. The infiltration of printing facilities was fundamental to propaganda sabotage operations. Throughout occupied Europe, the Nazis had commandeered printing presses and publishing facilities to produce their propaganda materials, administrative documents, and official notices. These facilities required skilled workers, typesetters, press operators, designers, and administrators. Resistance movements identified sympathetic workers in these facilities or placed their own operatives in positions where they could access production processes. Once inside, these resistance infiltrators had opportunities to sabotage propaganda production in numerous ways. They could introduce errors into printed materials, making them confusing or contradictory. They could alter production schedules so that materials arrived too late to be effective. They could steal official paper stocks, seals, and templates that could be used to create convincing forgeries. And most powerfully, they could produce entirely false materials that appeared completely authentic.
The technical challenges of creating convincing forgeries were substantial. Nazi documents used specific paper types, particular inks, official seals and stamps, distinctive fonts and layouts, and various security features designed to prevent counterfeiting. Resistance operatives working in propaganda sabotage had to master all these elements to create forgeries that could pass as genuine even under close examination by German authorities. This required access to materials and equipment, detailed knowledge of German administrative procedures, artistic and technical skills to replicate visual elements perfectly, and constant updates as the Germans changed their security features in response to discovered forgeries. The most successful propaganda sabotage operations were those that maintained access to actual German facilities, allowing them to produce false materials using the same equipment, paper, and processes as genuine materials. The false deportation orders mentioned at the beginning represent one category of propaganda sabotage, materials designed to confuse and disrupt German operations while protecting targeted populations. The Dutch resistance operation that produced these forgeries was remarkably sophisticated. Resistance members working in German administrative offices had stolen genuine deportation order templates, official seals, and even some blank pre-printed forms. Working in hidden printing facilities, they produced thousands of false orders that mixed accurate information with deliberate errors and contradictions. Some false orders specified reporting locations that didn't exist. Others gave dates that conflicted with other known German schedules. Some included subtle signs that could be recognized by those who knew what to look for, signals that the orders were false and that recipients should go into hiding rather than report. The genius of this operation was its multifaceted impact. For Jewish families receiving the orders, the confusion created space for resistance and survival. If some orders were false, maybe all orders could be questioned. This uncertainty encouraged people to seek help from resistance networks, to go into hiding, to refuse cooperation with German demands. For German authorities, the false orders created administrative chaos. They couldn't simply cancel all deportation orders because many were genuine. They had to attempt to sort real from false, consuming time and resources while their carefully planned deportation schedules fell apart. The credibility of their entire administrative system was undermined when people couldn't trust that official-looking documents were actually official. And for resistance networks, the operation demonstrated their reach and capability, boosting morale and encouraging further resistance activities. Another category of propaganda sabotage involved corrupting German propaganda materials to undermine their effectiveness or turn them against their creators. Resistance operatives with access to German printing facilities would introduce subtle changes into propaganda posters, leaflets, or newspapers before they were distributed. These changes might include altering statistics to make German claims obviously false, adding subversive messages in small print, changing dates or locations for announced events to create confusion, or suddenly modifying images to be unflattering or ridiculous. The key was making changes subtle enough that they wouldn't be caught during German quality control, but significant enough to undermine the propaganda's effectiveness. A poster announcing a Nazi rally might have the location changed so attendees showed up at the wrong place. A leaflet claiming German military victories might have casualty figures altered to obviously impossible numbers that made the entire message unbelievable. The sabotage of distribution networks represented another approach to propaganda sabotage. Nazi propaganda had to be distributed to reach its intended audiences, and this distribution relied on networks of transport, postal systems, and human distributors. Resistance movements targeted these networks in various ways. They would intercept shipments of propaganda materials and destroy them or replace them with resistance materials before they reached their destinations. They would bribe or intimidate distributors to lose German materials or distribute them to wrong locations where they would have no impact. They would disrupt transport systems so that time-sensitive propaganda arrived too late to be effective. In some cases, they would allow distribution to proceed, but follow up immediately with their own materials that contradicted or mocked the German propaganda, reducing its effectiveness.
Forged German propaganda that contained resistance messages disguised as Nazi communications represented perhaps the most sophisticated form of propaganda sabotage.
These operations required perfect replication of German propaganda styles, distribution through channels that would make the material seem authentic, and messages carefully crafted to serve resistance purposes while maintaining the appearance of German origin. One documented operation in France involved resistance operatives creating fake German propaganda posters that announced new curfew times. The posters looked completely authentic, using stolen German materials and perfect replication of German poster design. They were posted in locations where German authorities would normally place official notices. The new curfew times specified in the fake posters were slightly different from the actual curfew, creating confusion and making German authorities appear incompetent when people followed the fake posters and were then penalized for violating the real curfew they didn't know about. The psychological impact of propaganda sabotage extended far beyond the immediate practical effects. When people in occupied territories realized that not all German communications could be trusted, when they saw German propaganda containing obvious errors or contradictions, when they witnessed the chaos caused by corrupted information systems, their perception of German power and competence was fundamentally altered. The Nazi regime had presented itself as efficient, organized, and all-knowing. Propaganda sabotage revealed that the regime was vulnerable, that its systems could be penetrated and corrupted, that resistance was possible and effective. This psychological boost to resistance morale and this corresponding blow to German prestige were perhaps as valuable as the specific practical achievements of individual sabotage operations. The risks faced by those conducting propaganda sabotage operations were extreme. Working in German facilities or handling German materials meant constant detection. Unlike armed resistance that could strike and retreat, propaganda saboteurs had to maintain their positions over long periods to be effective. They had to produce their sabotage work while surrounded by Germans and collaborators who might notice any suspicious behavior. They worked with materials and evidence that would immediately condemn them if discovered. The penalty for being caught in propaganda sabotage was typically execution, often after torture to reveal details about resistance networks and operations. Yet hundreds of individuals across occupied Europe took these risks, driven by the conviction that disrupting German information systems was crucial to resistance success. The German response to propaganda sabotage evolved throughout the war as they gradually recognized the extent of the problem. Initially, instances of corrupted propaganda or false documents were often attributed to errors or incompetence rather than deliberate sabotage. As the pattern became clear, German authorities implemented various countermeasures. They increased security at printing facilities, limiting access and increasing surveillance of workers. They introduced more sophisticated security features in official documents, making forgery more difficult. They established verification systems where important orders or announcements had to be confirmed through multiple independent channels before being acted upon. They conducted investigations and purges of facilities where sabotage was discovered, often executing workers indiscriminately to intimidate others. These countermeasures had some effect, but could never completely stop propaganda sabotage because the Germans remained dependent on the same workers and systems that resistance movements had infiltrated. The coordination between different resistance groups conducting propaganda sabotage was often limited but occasionally achieved remarkable synergy. In some regions, multiple resistance cells would independently sabotage different parts of the same German propaganda system, creating cumulative effects far greater than any single operation could achieve. Intelligence sharing between groups allowed successful techniques to be replicated across different areas. Allied intelligence services sometimes provided support to propaganda sabotage operations, supplying materials, technical expertise, or information about German security measures. The British political warfare executive had specialists who worked with resistance groups to design propaganda sabotage operations that would be most effective in undermining German control. The use of humor in propaganda sabotage was both tactically effective and psychologically valuable. Resistance operatives would create fake German propaganda that was subtly ridiculous or that could be interpreted as unintentionally funny.
A fake German poster might announce a new regulation that was so absurd that people would laugh at it, associating the Nazis with incompetence, even as they might not consciously recognize that the poster was forged. Humor in Sabotage served multiple purposes. It made the materials memorable, it boosted the morale of occupied populations who desperately needed reasons to laugh, it made Germans seem foolish and vulnerable, and it created talking points that spread the sabotage's impact far beyond those who directly saw the sabotaged materials. The impact of propaganda sabotage on specific German operations demonstrates its practical military value. In Belgium, resistant sabotage of German labor conscription propaganda contributed significantly to the failure of German efforts to deport Belgian workers to German factories. Fake notices, corrupted genuine notices, and systematic disruption of the announcement and enforcement process meant that many workers never received valid orders or couldn't distinguish valid orders from false ones. The resulting confusion, combined with resistance networks helping workers go into hiding, meant that German labor quotas were never met. Similar operations in other occupied countries had comparable effects, denying Germany the labor resources it desperately needed for war production. In Italy, after the country's surrender in 1943, propaganda sabotage by Italian resistance groups working with Allied intelligence helped undermine German attempts to maintain control over northern Italy. Fake German orders and corrupted communications contributed to chaos in German military operations. Italian military units received contradictory orders and couldn't determine which were genuine. Civilian populations were confused about German requirements and restrictions. The resulting disorder complicated German defensive efforts and aided Allied military advances. While propaganda sabotage was certainly not the only factor in German difficulties in Italy, it contributed measurably to the degradation of German military effectiveness. The role of women in propaganda sabotage operations was substantial and often critical. Women working in German administrative offices, printing facilities, and distribution networks had access to materials and information that enabled sabotage operations. They were sometimes less suspected than men, allowing them to operate with slightly less scrutiny. Women resistance members were particularly effective in social engineering aspects of propaganda sabotage, using personal relationships and social situations to gather intelligence about German propaganda plans or to introduce sabotage into production processes. The contributions of women saboteurs were often unrecognized during and after the war, as with so much women's resistance work, but were nonetheless essential to operational success. The technical evolution of propaganda sabotage techniques throughout the war reflected the cat-and-mouse game between saboteurs and German security. Early sabotage operations used relatively simple methods: obvious errors, crude forgeries, straightforward destruction of materials. As German security improved, sabotage became more sophisticated. Subtle alterations, perfect forgeries, complex multi-stage operations. By late in the war, some propaganda sabotage operations were so sophisticated that they incorporated understanding of German quality control procedures, deliberately introducing errors that would be caught and corrected in predictable ways, then exploiting those correction processes to insert different sabotage that would not be detected. This level of sophistication required deep understanding of German systems and demonstrated the remarkable capabilities that resistance movements had developed.
The preservation of evidence about propaganda sabotage operations was often difficult because the operations themselves frequently destroyed documentation. Saboteurs couldn't keep detailed records of their activities without creating evidence that would condemn them if discovered. Much of what we know about propaganda sabotage comes from post-war accounts by participants, from German documents that noted problems with their propaganda systems without necessarily understanding that sabotage was the cause, and from physical examples of sabotaged materials that survived the war. This incomplete record means that the full extent of propaganda sabotage during World War II will never be completely known, and that many successful operations have been lost to history. The psychological toll on propaganda saboteurs was distinctive compared to other forms of resistance work. They had to maintain dual identities, appearing to work for the enemy while secretly undermining them.
They had to see their sabotage work being used by Germans, had to watch as materials they had corrupted went out under Nazi authority, had to wait sometimes for weeks or months before seeing results. The delayed gratification and the constant stress of deep cover work caused psychological challenges that many participants struggled with during and after the war. Some reported feeling complicit in Nazi operations even though they were sabotaging them, a form of moral injury that was difficult to process and overcome. The contribution of propaganda sabotage to the broader Allied war effort is difficult to quantify, but was undoubtedly significant. By disrupting German administration, causing confusion and delays, undermining the credibility of Nazi communications, and directly preventing deportations and conscriptions, propaganda sabotage operations saved thousands of lives and degraded German military and economic capabilities. The resources Germany devoted to securing its propaganda systems and responding to sabotage were resources diverted from military operations. The administrative chaos caused by corrupted information systems reduced German efficiency across all occupation activities, and the psychological impact of demonstrating Nazi vulnerability encouraged further resistance and reduced collaboration. The ethical considerations around propaganda sabotage were generally less troubling to participants than some other forms of resistance activity. Unlike armed resistance that involved killing or intelligence operations that might betray individuals, propaganda sabotage primarily attacked systems and institutions. The forgeries and corrupted materials targeted German authority rather than individual persons. Even when propaganda sabotage had lethal consequences, as when sabotaged military communications contributed to German military defeats, the moral weight seemed lighter than direct combat. This relative moral clarity, combined with the perception that propaganda sabotage was highly effective, made it an attractive form of resistance for many who might have been uncomfortable with more violent activities. The post-war recognition of propaganda saboteurs was limited and often came decades after their activities. Many operations remained classified for years because the techniques used remained relevant to intelligence services. Participants often didn't discuss their work publicly due to continued security concerns or because they had moved on from wartime activities. Some propaganda saboteurs were honored by governments after the war, but many received no recognition at all. The nature of their work, hidden and indirect, made it less visible and less celebrated than more dramatic forms of resistance. Yet historians studying World War II resistance have increasingly recognized that propaganda sabotage represented some of the most sophisticated and effective resistance operations of the war.
The techniques and principles of propaganda sabotage, developed during World War II, influenced Cold War information operations and continue to be relevant in modern information warfare. The concept of attacking enemy information systems, of using their own communications channels against them, of creating confusion and undermining trust in official communications, these approaches have been refined and adapted for new technologies and contexts, but remain fundamentally similar to what World War II resistance movements developed. Modern cyber operations that disrupt enemy communications or introduce false information into enemy systems are direct descendants of World War II propaganda sabotage, using digital tools to achieve goals that resistance fighters pursued with printing presses and forged documents. The legacy of propaganda sabotage extends to understanding of how information systems function and how they can be defended. The German experience of having their propaganda systems compromised taught lessons about information security that remain relevant. The need for verification systems, the importance of securing production and distribution channels, the recognition that any system involving human operators is vulnerable to infiltration. These insights emerged from the success of World War II propaganda sabotage and informed subsequent development of information security practices. In a perhaps ironic twist, the resistance movements that sabotaged Nazi propaganda helped advance understanding of how to protect information systems, knowledge that has been used by both democratic and authoritarian regimes since. This is the hidden story of how World War II propaganda sabotage saved thousands of lives by turning the Nazi regime's own information systems against them. It's a story of creativity and courage, of individuals who recognized that attacking enemy communications could be as effective as attacking enemy forces, and who risked everything to corrupt, forge, and disrupt the propaganda machinery that sustained Nazi control. The false deportation orders that saved Dutch Jewish families, the corrupted posters that made Germans look foolish, the sabotage distribution networks that prevented Nazi messages from reaching their audiences. These operations demonstrated that information itself is a battlefield, and that those who can dominate that battlefield can change the course of war. The propaganda saboteurs of World War II fought with printing presses and forged documents, with subtle alterations and bold deceptions, and their victories saved lives and undermined tyranny in ways that bullets never could. If this deep dive into how World War II propaganda sabotage saved thousands of lives by turning the Nazi regime's own information systems against them, please subscribe to Cipher Tales for more decoded mysteries from the hidden history of World War II. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Like this video if you found it revealing and thought-provoking. Every like helps us reach more people who appreciate the complex, hidden dimensions of history. Comment below and tell us, were you surprised by the sophistication and effectiveness of propaganda sabotage operations? Can you see connections between World War II propaganda sabotage and modern information warfare or cyber operations? What other World War II propaganda and espionage intersections should we decode next? The role of forged identity documents in rescue operations? How resistance movements disrupted Nazi communications networks? The intersection of printing technology and resistance activities? Share this video with anyone fascinated by World War II resistance history, information warfare, psychological operations, or the hidden stories of how creativity and deception saved lives. Until then, remember, sometimes the most powerful weapon is the enemy's own words turned against them. This has been Cipher Tales. Keep questioning, keep decoding, keep discovering the secrets that changed history.